Okay, so I will go ahead and share my screen and we can kind of jump right in here. All right, can everybody see that okay? Excellent. All right, so like Michelle said, my name is Melissa. I am a speech language pathologist at Redwood Heights in Oakland Unified. So I work with the Tackle program obviously very closely and very collaboratively. And I also serve the rest of the students at Redwood Heights. So the gen ed population, I try to work in gen ed classrooms and also special ed classrooms whenever I can, rather than being sort of isolated, which I know can happen really easily when we're sort of the lone speech language pathologist at a site. um, so I'll go ahead and just tell you a little bit about myself. I did not come from a speech language pathology background. My background is in theater. I also double majored in neuroscience and had intended to, I was on track to be pre med and applied for medical school and whatnot. Took a little bit of a detour and worked for a few years in special education because my primary area of interest in neuroscience was in cognition. Um, so after working for a few years in special education, was encouraged by the speech language pathologist there to go back to school for my master's in communication disorders. So I did. Um, I like to I like to tell people, you know, AAC is a really highly specialized field, obviously. And so you hear about AAC specialists, and particularly in school districts, what this often means is sort of a centralized team of consultants. And so whoever is on the AAC team, they're itinerant. They don't necessarily work at a specific site, and they provide a lot of consultation to a lot of different professionals, whether that be teachers or other speech pathologists, OTs, PTs, etc. My role is very different than that. And so I like to tell people that I'm an AAC direct service provider. So again, I serve one school site. It just so happens that the bulk of my caseload are students who have AAC needs. So obviously, with that comes a lot of consultation, particularly for, when my students are doing mainstreaming. I worked very closely with the gen ed teachers for that as well. But um, the difference being that I actually serve students directly, which the AAC specialists, at least in our district, do not. So my preference is to be working directly with students, and so I'm happy where I'm at. Um, okay, so before we get started with educationally relevant services, so we're going to be talking a lot about literacy today, a lot about how to kind of embed yourself in the curriculum, and again. Part of why I love what I do is the opportunity to collaborate with teachers and other professionals. Usually, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, but usually around this time in the class, you guys have just wrapped up an assignment asking you to like interpret evaluation results and reports and using that information to help you write goals. Is that true? Excellent. Okay, so I want to start by just very briefly talking about how the results of those tests, and particularly when we're talking about standardized measures, how those things can be misconstrued as areas of focus when it comes time to write goals. And it's actually not what that information is meant for when we're looking at standardized assessments. The purpose of that information is to illuminate whether or not a disorder or a disability exists. Most of the time, when we're working with people who have AAC needs, we already know that, right? Like, it's very clear that this is a student who has a disability in speech and language. So it doesn't actually make a ton of sense to look at the results of a standardized assessment and say, like, oh, okay, wow, like, he really bombed the subtest on idioms, let's say. Let's write a goal about idioms. That may be true, but it's not actually useful because, again, that's not what those assessments are designed for. They're designed to give you information about the presence of a disability. So, you, as the speech language pathologist or as the special educator, you are the one who is qualified to make those determinations, right? So, not some kind of like assessment kit. Lots of times these assessments are maybe many years old, haven't been updated. They're, also if you think about your like your practice from a cultural responsiveness lens, they're not necessarily included to um, be the best indicator for people who don't come from, middle class white backgrounds. And your students who have AAC needs are also included in that group, right? Like, I don't know of a single standardized measure that was normed using a significant population of AAC users. So they are also included in the cultural and linguistically diverse umbrella, even if in this case they do come from, middle class or affluent white backgrounds. So you are trained to synthesize everything that you know about a student and decide what areas you can target that are going to be the most impactful. But where does that information come from, if not from the tests you gave? So, I want to introduce just really briefly a tool that I adapted from somebody else that can help you kind of like frame those questions and think about them in a little bit more of an organized way. And so it's called the Meaningful IEP Worksheet. The one that I'm going to show you is blank, but everything on here, everything that you see in my whole presentation, basically, is linked. So you do have access to this. And if you look below, there's also a sample of one that's actually filled out. And so you can take a look at, how it might look when you go through it. But for now, I'm just going to show you the blank one just so you can see what it looks like. So the Meaningful IEP Worksheet is just a way that I will sometimes organize information in order to come up with not only the goals that are the most relevant, but also the goals that actually need to be targeted by me. There are lots of areas of need that are going to come up in an assessment that may not necessarily need a speech language pathologist to be able to target them. So um, you'll if you take a look on the far left here, for the purpose of this one, I have it divided into expressive, receptive, social, and speech. But sometimes what I'll do for students with AAC needs is to divide it up into the four competencies instead. So linguistic, operational, social, and strategic. And I'll just take a look and put everything that I know about that student, both their strengths and their needs, about that particular area of language. And I'll put that in under their present level. So, um, one of my favorite tools that you will probably hear me talk about if you take Michelle's class next semester also is a language sample. That is a wealth of information, right? There are so many things that you can glean from a language sample that are going to give you a really deep dive into a student's present levels. So, obviously, you can put information from standardized assessments in here too, right? Like if you're noticing that, you know, students have a really difficult time, let's say, in expressive language, they have a really difficult time formulating sentences independently, but if you give them a key word or two, then maybe their strength is being able to expand on that, right? So whatever it is that's coming up in the assessment, whatever patterns you're noticing are going to go in this first column here. The second column, and I would argue that if you're a school-based speech language pathologist, this is the most important column, is the impact in the classroom. So our job, again, the title of this lecture is Educationally Relevant Services. If there's no impact in the classroom, then it's not educationally relevant. There are lots of different ways that impact can look, right? It could be functional impact, it could be social impact. Depending on what the focus of your assessment is and what the profile of strengths and needs are, what impact means is going to be really different. Maybe your student doesn't have the language skills to be able to access grade level material. That is certainly academic impact, right? But this information is going to come from your teacher. So, again, that collaborative aspect of really knowing what's happening in the classroom, getting your teacher input, doing classroom observations, work samples or artifacts are, and again, a wealth of information. All of that is going to go here in the second column. And then the way that I sort of use this is to kind of look across, right? So like we have these these vertical planes where we can put information, but then I like to take a look and see like, okay, in expressive language, um, how how are the students' profile of strengths and needs, how are these manifesting in the classroom, right? So um, if the impact is that your student never raises their hand to participate, well, again, is that because they're having difficulty formulating something to say? So that's where you can sort of draw from their areas of need, how it shows up in the classroom, to write some of these suggested goals. So um, if we're doing our due diligence, you can also sort of leverage the strengths that your student has in order to support some of those needs. So that's how I kind of look in the horizontal plane to determine what my suggested goals are going to be. Oftentimes, again, if I'm talking about like Michelle or one of the other special ed teachers, we'll write our goals collaboratively, particularly because the SDC program that we work in is has a language focus, right? Has a communication focus. Um, and then again, you might see that there are a number of things that need support, that student needs support in, but that you don't necessarily need to be the leader of that support, right? So those are things where you can write as an accommodation as opposed to a specific goal. I like to think about my goals in terms of kind of like real estate. So it doesn't make sense to have a student with, let's say 30 minutes a week of speech services targeting 10 different goals, right? Maybe all of those 10 different things are areas of need, but I don't have I don't have the space in 30 minutes a week to really be effective on 10 different goals. And so I think about the things that are the most important. I think about the things that have, again, the biggest impact, or that where I feel like I can really offer my expertise the most. And so those are things that I'll kind of keep in the goals column. Other things I'll make suggestions for how the teacher can support it, right? Like offer a sentence frame, give a lot of models, right? Again, so these are all things that would support our sort of example student who has difficulty formulating things to say. Um, so that's kind of a quick rundown of the Meaningful IEP worksheet. Service time, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll fill out the communication severity scales, which again is linked here. This is a tool that many districts use and sort of gives you a window for, given the severity of a student's disorder, what might be an appropriate level of service minutes in a week. And it'll give you kind of a range of what you might consider. Very helpful tool when determining service minutes. So the other thing, the last thing that I'll say about the Meaningful IEP worksheet is that this can be a really helpful framework when you're in an IEP meeting too, or if you're trying to justify the services that you're providing, the amount of time, the goals, either to parents or to the rest of the team. I have found this to be really helpful because it puts everything out there in kind of one place. And again, once it's filled out, you can see very clearly how the skills, the profile of strengths and needs leads to a particular impact in the classroom, which leads to a certain goal being written. So um, that's something that you may want to consider using. Um, as you get closer and closer to your career. Okay, so I just want you all to think for a minute about this quote. And I'm going to keep talking, but I would love for you to share your thoughts in the chat. Um, and that is, the quote is, for individuals with AAC, literacy supports generative language. And so my question is, what do you think the authors of this article are trying to convey with what they're saying here? So, why do you think it's not enough to just say, like, okay, well, you communicate using a picture based system, and so you don't need to learn to read, right? Like, you have pictures that you have access to. And how do you guys think that um, that would fall short if that were the way that we were approaching AAC services? And you can either drop it in the chat, or if you have some thoughts that you want to share out loud, feel free to unmute yourself. I'm going to ask you guys for participation several times, so get
Well,
ready.
I think, yeah, well, I think that like pictures, they can all, look similar, but mean something different. And so I think being able to like have like the word written out, like on the picture symbol, then that would help the child.
Yeah, so having the words affiliated with the symbols, symbols aren't necessarily all concrete, right? Particularly if you think about um, verbs. Like I know one example just off the top of my head in Touch Chat is that there are several verbs that all use very similar symbols. So, like give, take, have, move. All of those pictures display a stick figure of some kind with like two arms outstretched toward like a little red block or whatever. And like without, without the movement, which most AAC systems are, their displays aren't, they don't have like video. Um, Without the movement of that action, it's really hard to tell what it would be. So sometimes text can help AAC users access their own device a little bit more. Yeah, totally. Let's see, some things from the chat. Some concepts are abstract. Yes, exactly. You need vocabulary to have more options. Reading can access other curriculum outside of special needs classroom. Absolutely. Our goal is always, always, always to be working towards a lesser and lesser restrictive environment, right? Yes, we provide special education. We provide accessible education, and our goal is always to be working towards the general education, right? Limits the potential of the child and excludes them from opportunities in the future. Absolutely. Literacy isn't just an academic pursuit, right? Literacy can help in like really functional ways outside of school, and in the future. Images can be confusing. The child can write, they have more options to communicate. Yes, all of these things are correct. And, um, so again, it just speaks to the importance of using literacy throughout your practice, even as a speech language pathologist, right? Even if we're not necessarily teaching letter sound correspondence or phonics or something like that. Literacy is really foundational to what we do, because literacy is language. Okay, so just quickly, I'm not going to read all this, but this is what ASHA has to say about educational relevance, and particularly with the focus on literacy, which makes a lot of sense given that we are experts in all the components of language that make literacy even possible in the first place. So, ASHA really advocates for SLPs as being part of the literacy development team, particularly in schools, obviously. And IDEA legislation, which is the legislation that governs individuals with disabilities in education, also mandates that all special education services are relevant to the curriculum or the classroom. So you have your goals, right? And it's time to move on to actually targeting those goals, right? You've determined what your service minutes are going to be, the intensity of services, the dosage. And now it's time to really reflect on how you're going to put those things into practice. So, writing the goals is just part one of this whole process, right? Like, you determine what the goals are going to be, but now there's the whole huge other question of how you're actually going to make progress on those goals. Um, most of the strategies that we use as educators and as speech language pathologists can be used anywhere, right? Like, I'm thinking about modeling, I'm thinking about recasts, I'm thinking about expansions, all, your milieu strategies, all the things that you learn don't dictate where those strategies are going to happen. So, I like to focus on what those strategies actually look like in different contexts. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about literacy based therapy. I don't remember, sometimes I include a little bit of curriculum based at the very end, and I don't remember if I did today. So we'll find out. Okay, so there are lots of reasons to use literacy as your context, right? That's what we've been talking about this whole time. One of those reasons is that's what the rest of the educators are also doing if you work in a school based setting. Um, Literacy is the foundation of all academics. So you spend the first couple of years in school learning to read, and then the whole rest of your academic career reading to learn. You guys are no exception, right? You are constantly reading to learn in graduate school. Um, so, by that logic, all school-based SLPs should have a significant focus on literacy. Um, I use literacy-based therapy as the context for what I'm doing probably 95% of the time. Um, Beyond that, there are lots of other benefits. Practicing skills in predictable contexts reduces the cognitive load of participation. I'm sure you've heard that ad nauseum from Michelle, reducing the cognitive load, right? Books also provide a really language rich background for intervention. And so, when we're thinking about students who we know have fewer exposures to robust language, they get more opportunities to hear it, even if those words or language structures are not being directly targeted. Um, just ancillary exposure to those things is beneficial to them. It's also possible to embed any goal into this context. We'll talk more specifically about some suggestions and some examples of that in a little bit. And then lastly, I just want to skip on to the last item, which is also very important. It's a little bit selfish, but it is important. It's that we have so much on our plates as educators and as speech language pathologists, and you know, frankly, doing literacy based therapy makes your planning process easier. It makes it more sustainable, you know. So if you're a speech language pathologist, which with a large caseload, inevitably you will be a speech language pathologist with a large caseload. It's really important to find systems that streamline the process of providing services. So rather than trying to find individualized worksheets or activities or what have you for each of your students, for each of their separate goals, um, it's just not a sustainable way to conduct a practice. What I do is I pick one book, maybe two, and I use that book or couple of books all week long for all of my sessions, and sometimes for multiple weeks. And we can do a really deep dive into a book that has like a lot of stuff to unpack. Um, you know, so I save myself a really enormous chunk of planning time that I was previously using trying to come up with all of those individualized activities. Again, this is not to say that what you're doing is not individualized, right? Obviously, the strategies that you use, the questions that you ask, the things that you're targeting, those are all individualized for each of your students, but you're not having to um, create or generate as many materials. Um, the other thing that I'll say is that, you know, and again, I'm coming from a place of like I used to do this, so um, a lot of those materials are not evidence based, and that, you know, is a problem, right? Like we come from a profession that is very data driven and that it's really important to make those data driven decisions. And so um, evidence-based practice obviously being a huge point of discussion in our field. And so um, literacy-based therapy is highly evidence-based. And here is just a selection of that evidence. All of this is specific to research that's been done in the field of literacy interventions in AAC, because this is an AAC focused class. But obviously, there's a really large body of evidence at this point in support of literacy or narrative based interventions, just sort of generally, right? Not just for AAC, but for all students. Um, so again, this is just a selection, but you know, all of these studies you'll notice are rather recent. And I imagine that in the time since I have updated these slides, there is even more evidence that I could point you in the direction of. So, um, but all that to say that there are people now who are exploring this and specifically exploring the role of literacy in AAC, um, you know, as we speak. So, of course, we know that children who use AAC produce shorter narratives than their speaking peers. So, that's an area of need for sure. There's also growing evidence to suggest that including aided input or modeling improves not just expression, but also comprehension, which is is relevant to shared reading. Um, a variety of different literacy interventions have been used to improve word reading, vocabulary development, syntax and morphology. Basically, all areas of language can be supported through literacy and narrative based interventions. Um, so, I don't know how many of you are speech language pathologists and how many of you are special educators. For those of you who are speech language pathologists, there is a little bit of a caveat here, right? So, there is an important point that I want to make about what we're actually doing when we're doing literacy-based therapy. Um, we are teaching students not to read per se. If you're a special educator, you are teaching students to read, so ignore that. But as speech pathologists, we're teaching how to understand and how to manipulate the language that they read. So we're teaching students to connect ideas. We're teaching them to develop vocabulary, making inferences, right, which plays a role in social skills as well. We're teaching them to draw conclusions, um, to synthesize all of that information into something that they can gain meaning from, and understanding the parts of a story so that they can tell their own personal stories better, right? Like sometimes I target narrative because I want to know more about my student. And without narrative skills, they're not going to be able to tell me about what happened over the weekend, right? Or their mom just had a baby. So, it's important for lots of different reasons, not just academic ones. So, another way to kind of think about this is that we're building schema when we do literacy based therapy. We're providing a framework within which to learn all of the multitude of other skills that we're trying to teach. Um, I'm not going to go over all of this in the interest of time, but again, all of my references and whatnot are linked at the end of the presentation. So you're going to have access to all of this for for forever, or for as long as you keep the slides. Um, so again, if you work in a school-based setting like I do, um, your responsibility is to the Common Core state standards. And this, again, is a very, very small selection, mostly from speaking and listening and the reading and literacy state standards. But these are just a handful of the Common Core state standards out there that are directly relevant to the skills that we work on in speech, right? So some of these, for example, um, similes, metaphors, symbolism are related to kind of like cognitive skills and comparison and descriptive language. Some, like conflict resolution, are more relevant to social skills. But there are a lot of different um, state standards that are relevant and that we, again, are responsible for supporting through our services. Um, yes, USA. Um, Common Core state standards are, that should be like your bread and butter. When you're writing goals, they have to be related to Common Core state standards. Otherwise, what are you doing in a school-based setting? So um, glad to get some love for the Common Core over here. Okay, so we're gonna before I move on, we're gonna switch gears a little bit. So before I move on, I want somebody to ask me a question. I don't care who and I don't care what, but somebody's gonna ask me a question. I'm gonna wait for it.
I actually do have a quick question. I was like just typing it in the chat too. What does the RL stand for on those? I'm not familiar.
Yeah, Michelle, can you answer that? Is it reading and literacy?
And is that ages we're looking
I
at?
think
Or
so. I think it's reading and literacy. I don't know exactly. I
Yeah,
know
so
there's
reading and
speaking and
literacy, and then
listening.
the first
Yeah.
number is the grade. So this, for
Okay.
example, this first one under conflict resolution here, oops, would be reading and literacy, second grade, and then there are like a bunch of different like sub, what am I trying to say? Substandards.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so there are reading and listening ones. There are also reading and literacy. There's speaking and listening. There are foundational literacy. And so there are tons of different standards, and they're organized. It's cool. It's good. It's a good thing to just type into Google and take a look at.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not familiar with it. So I'm going to look that up. And so basically there's like these standards, and then it just talks about like RL 2.3 would be like conflict and like conflict resolution. And then it would just, or here we go. Let's do it together.
Lori, the class in the fall, SPED 746,
Yeah.
is all about school-based instruction, and so we'll spend tons of time with the standards.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Reading literature. That's right. Because there's also informational text, which again is a great resource for you. So let's look up that exact one. What was it? 2.3?
3, yeah.
Yeah.
Describe how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges, right? So if we're looking at like how characters in a story approach a challenge or approach a problem, which if you use Story Grammar Marker as your framework, every good story has a problem. You know, that can give us some information about like how these characters approach solving problems or conflicts in their life, right? The Common Core state standards are great. And sometimes I look through them when I'm looking for, you know, just like sort of ideas for a goal. And there are a handful of times where you can just say like, oh, great. Like that's actually my goal right there. I don't even need to rewrite it, you know, like this is the goal. So they can be really helpful. And then, you know, of course, like if you can align to a Common Core state standard like that, there's no question about whether or not it's academically relevant, right? So great question. Common Core, it's awesome. Okay, so like I said, we're kind of switching gears. We're going to get into the like actually, you know, how to do it time. So just quickly, some preliminary thoughts on how to choose a book for your literacy-based therapy. So first of all, I think being able to read a book quickly is really important. If you're thinking about the way that your services are provided, lots of times, you know, we're sort of splitting sessions into these like 30-minute chunks. Some districts do 20 minutes. That's their like kind of base like service provision is like a 20-minute block, which is so short. You don't want to spend the whole time just reading a book, right? And there are lots of times where the book that I want to use that I think is going to be like really fruitful and have a lot of impact. Maybe I'm not going to be able to read it in 10 minutes, but in that case, I can split it up over the course of multiple days or multiple sessions, right? And so the other thing that I'll sometimes do is for older students, like fourth and fifth grade, whatever book they're reading in their class, whatever chapter book they're reading in their class, I'll just kind of follow along with them. And so obviously, we're not going to read the whole chapter book in 10 minutes, but maybe we could read one page. We might be able to read one page that is relevant, you know, or that they just read in class yesterday, or maybe they're reading tomorrow, and, you know, do some analyses on just that excerpt regarding whatever it is their goals are. So you know, the book, it's not a script, right? Nobody is going to be mad at you if you start a book and you don't read all the way through to the end, or if you start a book and for the sake of time or because of the language level of your students, you really paraphrase and like cut out, you know, big chunks. Maybe you read every other page instead of every page. Whatever choice you make, it's okay. That book is a tool for you to use. It's not, yeah, again, it's not a script. So it should also be goal driven, right? you need to have lots and lots of demonstrations of the target that you're going for. It could be a target vocabulary word that you use over and over and over, right? Um, the example that comes to mind, like just first thing is, uh, one of the core vocab words. If you're targeting C, brown bear, what do you see? It says that on every single page, right? They're going to have lots of opportunities to practice using that core vocabulary word. Um, the I think about this if I'm doing like Arctic services too. Um, there need to be lots of demonstrations of a target sound. If I have a student who's working on saying their sound, and I choose a book where the sound isn't really that present, well, I'm probably not going to have a lot of opportunities to practice that, right? Um, that said, targets can be implicit, right? They don't need to be something that is exactly said in the text of the book. Again, the book is not a script, it's a tool. You can make up a target. Um, one of my favorite books that again you'll hear about more if you take Michelle's class next semester is Room on the Broom. And in the story, there's a witch who flies around with all of her animal friends, and they go all these different places, and she loses all of her belongings and the animals find them. It doesn't really say the word go in the book, but it's a good book still to target the core vocabulary word go, right? They go to the forest to find a owl, they go to the pond to find a frog, they go to the wherever. So it can be implicit in the story. It doesn't necessarily have to be explicitly repeated throughout the text. Okay, so with reference to scope and sequence, um, in general education, obviously, and if you look at the Common Core state standards a little bit more and see how they're sort of all connected to each other, right? Concepts are taught in a very particular order. You can't learn to read before you know the alphabet. So, as speech language pathologists, we don't necessarily have a curriculum that we're working from, but we do have the scope and sequence that is language development, right? Like there is a typical order in which language skills develop. Um, Quick caveat that the development of language for um, neurotypical students is very different than the development of language for neurodivergent populations. So the scope and sequence is going to be a little bit different, right? If we're talking about analytic language processors versus Gestalt language processors who learn like the big chunks before they learn the small chunks. But again, knowing your students and knowing what their profile is going to help you determine which skills are typically acquired and in what order. That's going to be your scope and sequence. So it's not just picking targets from a book and then drilling those targets, right? Like there has to be sort of a progression to the books that you're choosing over time. And then lastly, if you can align it with the curriculum, again, the whole point of this lecture is that we're providing educationally relevant services. And how do you best do that? You align with the curriculum. So whatever is happening in your SDC or whatever is happening in your general education class, the more you can match that, the better off you're going to be. And let's see. Sorry, Michelle, I just saw your message. Let me go. I have one more slide and then we'll do a quick 5-minute break. Okay, so related to scope and sequence is your zone of proximal development, right? So this is something that I'm sure you guys, regardless of what your background is, whether in speech or special education, you hear about kind of ad nauseum, right? So the purpose of our services is to work in that zone of proximal development. So These are obviously it's fluid, it changes as students learn and grow. But we're not going to work on things that the student can already do. And we're also not going to work on things that are like really far outside of their reach. We're going to work right at that level where they're sort of instructional, right? So they can do these things with support. A lot of districts use F&P or other, sort of like whatever you call them, other tools for measuring literacy development. So some terms that you might hear in the gen ed setting, particularly, is these terms independent. That would be the middle circle or the smallest circle, their instructional level, and then their frustration level. Those are things where even with support, it's going to be really challenging for them to do. All right, so let's take a 5-minute break, Michelle. Is that what you said? Before we move on to the steps of literacy-based therapy.
Thanks, Melissa.
Do you want me to pause this recording?
Yeah, I'm gonna do it.
Okay, so for those of you who messaged me about it during the break, my apologies. I forgot to update the permissions for the documents that I linked, but you should be able to get them now. So I have changed who can view them. If they're still not working, please let me know and I will send them to you directly afterwards. Okay. So the steps for literacy-based therapy. As you can imagine, as with most things, there are any number of frameworks that exist for how to do literacy-based therapy. We're going to be talking about one specific framework that I generally always work from, and it's from Teresa Ukrainitz's work. She has been doing this for many, many years. Her book is called Contextualized Language Intervention. It's really a great resource if this is something that you are interested in. I want to say it's linked at the end. If not, I can put it in the chat a little bit later. But she has really documented many, many years of research on this topic, and her framework is the one that just works the best for me, and that I'm the most familiar with. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. Okay, so based on Teresa Ukrainitz's framework, there are 5 steps for a successful and thorough literacy-based therapy unit, let's call it. First of all is the pre-reading knowledge activation, and then which is sort of like your priming activities. The dialogic reading, so that's the part where you actually read the book, or read what parts of the book you intend to read if you're not reading the whole book. The post reading is a comprehension discussion, so making sure that students have understood the material that you are presenting. And then you have some focus skill activities where you're working on, sort of the specific goals that your students have. And then the very last step is sort of a culmination of all of these steps, right? So everything that you have worked on up until this point, and you generate a new parallel story. And we'll talk more specifically about each of these steps in just a second. So these below are a couple other links for other ways to do literacy-based therapy, other sort of like frameworks. I want to say one of them is like a blog post. Lots of SLP bloggers out there doing literacy-based therapy, which is really lovely because it's they provide a really like user-friendly approach to literacy-based therapy. And then this right here, the Crowd Peer Seer, is another resource that you have access to. And these are some of the strategies that you're going to use throughout dialogic reading. Um, and we'll go over these a little bit more when we get to that part. So also, just to mention, this picture right here on the right is how I organize my books. So you can't, I don't think, probably see it, but the tabs on these hanging file folders are all themes. So I think this first one here is back to school. I can't read these other ones. Zoo animals, bats, Thanksgiving, leaves. Um, I organize a lot of times I organize my books into sort of different themes, and then we do kind of thematic units. Usually our theme will last like a whole month, and then I'll have several books that align to that same theme that I can read all one after another. And that helps me kind of create these like cohesive units of study um, throughout the year. And so I organize my books in hanging file folders with any other materials or visuals that I might need that are specific to those books, and sort of file them based on units that I've done in the past or might want to do in the future. Okay, so let's break down the steps of the literacy-based therapy framework. So first of all, the way that we're going to kind of go about this is we'll look at two different levels of communicator. So these early language goals are for like your more emergent communicator, that kind of skill level. And then the next slide, I'll do one that is like a later language goal. So a goal that I might use with like a context dependent or maybe a transitional independent communicator. So each step of the framework will look at one earlier developing skill and one a little bit later developing skill. So the pre-reading knowledge activation, like I mentioned, is um, your priming activities, right? So you guys, I'm sure, have learned about um, priming and how we all, students included, learn better when they first access what they already know about a topic. It's not limited to students with disabilities. It's true for typical students. It's true for students who are in the process of learning a second or an additional language. If you think back to your own time as a young student, you probably remember at some point doing like a KWL or like one of those kinds of charts, right? Where you first, um, before you start a unit, you talk about what you already know on that topic and sort of like activate all of your information, all of your structure and your scaffolding that you have relative to that topic already. So the impetus behind this step of the literacy-based therapy framework is just that. So when your brain is primed first, it facilitates learning the material much better, much more quickly, more efficiently. So maybe for this example, if we're reading the book Stella Luna, which is where this picture of the bat in the middle here, in the middle of my little chart comes from, maybe we're going to start by using our describing framework. And we are going to talk about what we know about bats already. What category or group do they belong to? What do we know that they do? What do they look like? Maybe what parts do they have? A personal experience or some kind of connection that we have with bats. So for this example, one of my students told me that he really likes Batman. That's great. That's a great connection to bats. That helps him, you know, helps him have something like a jumping off point when we start to talk about Stella Luna and because she's a bat. So um, if you look over at the goal, we're doing just that, right? So we're this is a goal that I often use to target strategic competence, right? Because using those describing words, being able to talk about things using different words than maybe the one word that it's called, the special name, you being able to talk about things in different words is really good for for when you need to repair a communication breakdown. Um, so this one is a little bit earlier, again, more like emergent communicator goal. So let's take a look at one that comes a bit later in the developmental sequence. Similarly, we're still looking at a goal targeting and looking at an activity targeting communication breakdown repair. But for this student, they're practicing repairing with a complete sentence. So, same skill, we're still working on describing, or if you want to get fancy with it, circumlocution, which is the technical term. Um, Now we're working on a formula, though, for that description. So, our formula is word equals category plus attribute. So a cactus is a plant that lives in the desert. So in this case, not only do they have to be able to describe something in different words, or at least like, kind of retrieve all of that descriptive information in that language, but in order to be really understood, they need to be able to pick out the most salient attribute of that thing. So the thing that sets it apart from every other item in that category, right? To say I'm thinking of a plant that is green, well, that wouldn't necessarily cause you to retrieve a mental image of a cactus, right? There would be a lot of other plants that you would probably think of before cactus. So I need to think of a salient feature of a cactus. So a plant that lives in the desert, or a plant that has spines, one of the salient attributes. So we often switch it up when we're practicing this skill. So sometimes we work on making the whole sentence. Sometimes we turn it into like a barrier game, and the students will say like, "I'm thinking of a animal with 8 legs," and the others have to guess what it is, right? An octopus. Um, And of course, whatever we're describing, whatever things that we're choosing as our sort of like exemplars in an activity like this are going to relate back to whatever the book is that we're going to be reading. So again, in this last example, maybe we're describing Stella Luna because we're about to read Stella Luna, or because we're embarking upon a whole unit about bats or Halloween or something, right? So the things that we're doing in advance of reading the book help give the book some kind of context again. So, again, the pre-reading knowledge activation is the goal of this step is to prime knowledge that students already have, or provide knowledge they're going to need in order to understand the book, right? So our goal here is to promote comprehension through whatever strategies of, um, activating that retrieval or pre-teaching, whatever the case may be. A lot of times with our students who have very complex needs, or who are dependent on adults for mobility, they only have access to whatever experiences we decide to provide to them, right? Like if we never push that wheelchair over to the garden, they might not have ever had an experience with a garden. They might not know what it's like, what's there, um, what happens in a garden. And so our goal here is to, again, work on building that schema so that when it comes time to read a book about bats, an animal which they may have no personal experience with, they're gonna have some exposure already and be able to understand it a little bit better. So just a few quick ideas for the pre-reading knowledge activation. Graphic organizers like the ones that I showed you are great. I use graphic organizers all the time. I love a good framework. Other things that I do really frequently are book walks. A book walk is where you turn through the pages of a picture book. You don't read any of the words, but you look at each page and you see, like, wow, like, what do I notice? What's happening on this page? Maybe we can make some predictions about what this book is about. Giving some exposure to the text before you even read the words, right? Those are skills that those of us who are fluent readers do without even thinking about it, right? They're so ingrained in our experience of reading a book that we don't even realize that we do that, and that it contributes to our comprehension of a story. um, any kind of like brainstorm. Again, I mentioned the KWL chart a little bit earlier. Some kind of like group sharing of ideas is great. Pre-teaching vocabulary, making predictions. Virtual field trips can be really fun, and especially in the era of like COVID and virtual services and those kinds of things, finding YouTube videos is awesome. If we're going to read a book about zoo animals, maybe there's a tour, a zoo tour somewhere on YouTube or the internet, that we can watch. We, a few months ago, did one on amusement parks, and most of our students have never been on a roller coaster. Well, guess what's on YouTube? It's roller coaster reviews from somebody riding in the seat of a roller coaster. So we took a few virtual tours like that. There are also obviously lots of online resources for like videos or other kind of like supplemental things. Brain Pop is probably my favorite. I think, it's a bunch of videos made by a cartoon guy and his cartoon robot friend, and they're pretty engaging, and my students like them. So, but lots of other resources that are in that same vein that are easily used for the pre-reading knowledge activation. Um, so that's that. So the next step of the framework is the dialogic reading. So this is the part where you're just reading the book, right? Um, you'll also hear this sometimes called shared reading. And there's one key difference from this, as a step in a literacy based therapy framework, and just a read aloud. And the difference is in the name, right? So this is an interactive activity, it's a dialogue. That's why it's called that. So the aim here is a handful of different things. We might be building print awareness. We recently did a part of a unit in a book where we were exploring different types of punctuation, right? So an exclamation point versus a question mark versus a period. And how do those different types of punctuation inform what you do with your voice, right? Like, um, how do you change your voice or your internal reading voice based on the punctuation at the end of the sentence? So that might be a good print awareness kind of activity. Maybe we're introducing new vocabulary. Um, and just a second, I promised you that we will go over the dialogic reading strategies. There is a structure. I love, as I mentioned, I love structures and frameworks. There is a structure for introducing new vocabulary. Um, Maybe we're working on modeling good reading fluency. Reading fluency is one of the predictors of reading comprehension, right? If you're reading a story like a list of words, um, let's see, here in Stella Luna, it says, Mama, bird, flew, away, something else, food, for, her, babies. Well, that's going to be a really challenging story to understand if that's the way that I read. So we may not be teaching fluency, teaching reading fluency per se, but we can model fluent reading behaviors, um, using intonation and prosody to help make meaning from what we're reading. Maybe we're discussing the components of a narrative. So all of these things, all these skills, all these language skills are embedded into the literacy context. All of these things come into play here. And so there is a lot to do during the dialogic reading step. There's a lot to remember. Um, uh, Once we'll get to the different kinds of prompts in just a second, but suffice it to say that it's important to really be prepared in advance to do this step effectively. So you'll notice in the picture there of Stella Luna that one thing that I really like to do is add sticky notes in the corners of my books. And it helps me um, not only be measured in my pace, right? Like, I probably don't want to ask a question every single page. That's kind of cumbersome. Um, and I probably don't want to ask a whole bunch of questions right up front and then none at the end, or vice versa. If I prep my books in advance, it can help me be intentional and also, um, remember the things, the pieces that I wanted to point out or ask about. And then also the benefit of that is that those sticky notes, I probably put them in my book, 6 years ago, and they're still there. And every time I go to read that book, I can kind of flip through it and say, like, oh, yeah, this is how I targeted this last time. I'm going to do that again this time. Or maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm going to do it a little bit differently. But you can prep a book one time and then not really ever have to do it again. You just have to, follow your own cues that you gave yourself. Um, so here's another example. This is from Room on the Broom, which I mentioned is one of my favorite books. This goal is about expanding communicative functions. So again, having the little sticky note prepped in advance can really help me achieve that. So I can plan ahead for this student. I want them to answer some questions, but I also want them to make comments. I also want them to ask a question or direct my actions, right? Maybe it's their job to turn me or to tell me to turn the page. And if I am prepared in advance and sort of give myself cues, then I don't have to really remember, what I have asked them to do and when. Additionally, if you're feeling so inclined, you could use those same sticky notes to kind of take some data on the questions that you ask, right? If you know who you're asking and what you're asking, you can just give a little mark to indicate what the response was, or if they did it independently or with a prompt or whatever, what have you. So it helps me maintain a really good diversity of prompts instead of always resorting to, oh, what happened here? What happened here? What happened here? Right? Um, okay, so let's take a look at the dialogic reading strategies. So this is just a different kind of visual for the same information or some of the same information here. So crowd is these are different kinds of prompts or different kinds of questions that you would want to ask. So completion prompts are these are really good for repeated line texts, right? So or something where there's a rhyme. Anything where there's like a fill in the blank that's pretty predictable, right? So again, to go with the age old example of brown bear, what do you see? So, having that expectant pause and waiting for your students to fill in the last word of the line or phrase for you. Again, this is something that should be very obvious or that you have explicitly taught in the past, right? If your students don't know the book Brown Bear, and you try and have them do a completion prompt for C, and you've neither modeled the word C and they don't know the story, well, it's probably not going to be a very successful completion prompt, right? So maybe you read a few pages and then ask for them to complete it once the pattern has been established. Recall prompts. These are kind of the questions that you probably think about the most quickly. These are the what happened, right? What happened in this story? What happened on this page? What happened before? Things that ask a student to recall or remember something from the story. Um, Open-ended prompts and WH prompts are similar but different. So WH prompts, obviously, are questions that start with a WH question. Pretty simple, right? Open-ended prompts elicit more complex language um, because WH prompts or WH questions can often still be answered in single words, right? What did you eat for breakfast? Cereal. Open-ended prompts are things like, tell me about blank. Um, you know, it's pretty hard to answer a prompt like that in one word. And so, just by nature of the way it has been asked, it can really encourage students to use more language. So, again, it's important to get a good variety of these questions, right? You want to ask a little bit of everything. Um, some students are going to excel with some question types and not others. But this is the best way to, again, kind of like diversify the types of question that you're asking. The last one, distancing prompts, are things that ask students to make like a personal connection to the story. If we're talking about the book Chrysanthemum, about a girl who gets made fun of for having a long name on her first day of school. Um, maybe a distancing prompt is, how did you feel going to kindergarten for the first time? Do you remember a time where something like this happened to you? So things that, again, kind of like put some space between the story and the student and ask them to reflect a little bit. So this particular strategy uses the same prompts, right? Still uses crowd. But the way they recommend approaching this in a dialogic reading is to first make a comment about the book. And then sometimes if you make a comment, you have a little bit of an expectant pause. You won't even necessarily need to ask a question. So you might have students who decide to contribute all on their own. Asking a question would be next, and then respond by adding a little more. So you may notice this is exactly the same strategy that I used with you all at the very beginning here when I asked you to comment. I made a comment about the quote. You guys had some comments. I asked a specific question. And then to your responses, I, reflected that back to you and added a little bit of my perspective. So just sort of a general teaching strategy, regardless of what age you are working with. The other strategies here, so peer is basically a process for expanding utterances. And then SEER is the vocabulary strategy that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So if you come across a new word or a word that you think is really important to target, saying the word, or in AAC, modeling the word, especially, right, saying the word in the students language that they're going to use, showing them where it is, how to say it, that kind of thing, explaining what the word means, So when I do tier 2 vocabulary words, so when I teach words that are really important and can be used across many contexts, I'll try to explain it using core vocabulary, right? And I'm blanking on an example like right off the top of my head, but Michelle, if you have one, um, chime in. Giving an example from the child's experience and then having everybody repeat the word together or find it in their device, whichever. Michelle, did you have one?
I was just going to say that this week you taught the words both and but, and you had them mean the same as, yeah, so both you defined as like something that's the same, and but you defined as something that was different.
There you go. Doing it all the time and I don't even know it. Okay, so on to the comprehension discussion. Whoops. Hold on a minute here. Okay. So the comprehension discussion is an opportunity after having read the book. Ooh, and I'm just noticing what time it is. To make sure that your students understood everything that you wanted them to from the text. So this is a pretty focused discussion. So what I often like to do is read a book multiple times and have like totally different comprehension discussions each time, depending on what our lens is. So again, to draw from one of my favorite examples, Room on the Broom, really recommend that book, you guys. I use that book a lot as as part of the Halloween theme, right? It's about witches and monsters and dragons and what have you. And we can build a lot of schema around that. But I also sometimes pull it out and reread it during a unit on friendship because the book is also about helping each other and being kind. So in those two scenarios, the focus of our comprehension discussion is going to be very different. Um, you know, what I want them to understand from a Halloween unit versus a friendship unit is going to be really different. So, another point that I want to make about the comprehension discussion is that it's not meant to test students, right? This isn't like a data probe where you're asking them questions and then evaluating whether or not their answer is correct. This is a series of prompts. It doesn't even have to be questions, but it's a series of prompts about literal or inferential parts of the story that is meant to help illuminate the text. So it's a highly, highly scaffolded discussion. And again, the focus here is on comprehension. They're not going to get what I want them to get out of the book unless I've made sure they understood the parts that I wanted them to. And again, here is a later language goal for the same comprehension discussion. So answering basic and inferential WH questions. This is another strategy and also book that I really like. For a student who is working on making inferences about what different characters' perspectives are. So, what are they thinking? And so sometimes I'll use sticky notes to add in here either a thought bubble or a speech bubble or a little heart. And we can talk about what the characters are thinking, feeling, and saying. So again, that's a way that I can sort of make sure they are picking up the pieces that I want them to pick up from this particular text. So the strategies that you're going to use during the comprehension discussion are, again, it's highly scaffolded. There's a lot of support happening during this time. It's not meant to be a test of any kind. It's not meant to be like graded or predictive or anything like that. You're going to refer to the book a lot during this. And so oftentimes if I'm sort of in a place where I need to combine multiple steps of the literacy-based framework, um, I'll combine the comprehension discussion with the dialogic reading, and we'll just sort of have this ongoing discussion as we're reading the book about what's going on and making sure that they're understanding what I want them to understand. So referring to the book frequently, using visuals if you have visual supports that you use or that your students benefit by. And again, you can't add to your schema about a topic if you don't really know what's going on. So this step is really important to make sure that you're pretty thorough. And we'll talk about it again, how important the comprehension is when we get to the parallel story as well. So just really quickly, there are any number of frameworks on lots of these topics, including scaffolding. So this is sort of the way that I think about scaffolds. Structural scaffolds are anything that changes the environment or the way in which you're presenting the targets, which if you're doing literacy-based therapy, you're already doing most likely, right? Um, and then for the interactive scaffolds, these are things that happen in real time as you're teaching. So the response prompts are things that support the student to come to the correct answer before they actually answer. So for example, modeling, visuals, or like backwards chaining or some other kind of like behavioral support. Linguistic scaffolds should also be familiar to you, especially if you're a speech language pathologist, because these are the things that you hear about over and over again. Recasts, expansions, the milieu strategies, modeling. And the last one, regulatory scaffolds, are things that aid student engagement. So they could be like reward systems or other like behavior management, praise, giving students feedback. All of those things help kind of regulate student behavior and help them be kind of active participants in the conversation. So all these things are taking place within the comprehension discussion to support your students in their understanding, because you can't add to your schema if you can't understand what's happening. So this component of the literacy-based therapy framework is sort of like the parking lot. It's the place where any goals or skills that you haven't gotten to target in the other steps can go, because it's the most flexible. It also provides an opportunity for some more targeted and repeated practice of skills that you may have been able to address throughout the other steps and throughout the reading. This is where I often incorporate practice of like speech sounds if my students are working on that. Grammar goals are also really good to get some like kind of drill-based practice in. But you'll notice, again, what's going on in this picture. All of my targets are selected from the book that we're reading. So again, they're getting, even if we're doing like sort of a drill-based activity, they're getting the contextualized practice and like the repetition with variation. So if my students are working on describing words, great, here's a list of adjectives from the book. Here are adverbs, and oh look, did you notice that all of these adverbs, all these words end with ly, and now we're talking about grammatical morphemes, right? So it's a really easy way to sort of get to any of the other things that you haven't done just yet. Maybe we're practicing with narrative structure. In any case, whatever it is you're working on, your students should be able to identify what their goals are. So, as an educator or a speech language pathologist, part of your instructional routine should always be setting the objective, right? So, regardless of what you're working on, you're going to have that learning target that you're explicit about so that kids can look back and say, like, oh, yeah, today we did this. Today I worked on retelling a story. I also want to point out that I don't use this terminology anymore of the first, then next, last when doing story retells. But I keep the slide in here for exactly that reason, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about it. Why it's important to be really precise in your language and in the frameworks that you choose to use with your students. So early on in my career, I used a framework. I used this framework. And I had a lot of experiences with students telling me stories, and also, in consulting with general education teachers who use like beginning, middle, and end. And what I found was this. So I would ask a kid, okay, what happened in the beginning of the story? And then they would just tell me the whole story, right? Because the boundaries of what's the beginning, what's the middle, and what's the end are really pretty amorphous. They are not clear. Um, so once we get through all of this, I'll show you at the end the narrative tool that I use now, and that is a lot more concrete, and has I've had much better success using with my students, because the things that it's asking for are are less abstract, right? They have like clear boundaries. Okay, so very last we come to the parallel story, and this step of the framework, for me, I think is has the most variability. So this one looks really different, um, depending on kind of where I'm going with a particular unit. The rest of my steps look generally the same each time, with just the context of a different book. So obviously, like different questions being asked or a different focus, right? But the purpose of this step is to take the plot elements, or to take the vocabulary and the sentence structures and the speech sounds, any of the skills that we've been practicing in the first four steps, and apply those things to a new story that the students construct. So it's called a parallel story, because it's basically the same story. They're rewriting the same story, but maybe with like one major difference or change. Um, you know, Stella Luna. How could we rewrite the Stella Luna book from the bird's perspective instead of the bats? Or how could we rewrite, actually using a different rewriting a story from a different perspective is one that we do a lot. How could we rewrite the Three Little Pigs from the wolf's perspective? So creating a story that has basically all the same elements, but just is like a little bit different in some way. Um, but this also, what this looks like really depends on what the focus of our reading was. So maybe it's perspective taking, and we do the perspective switch. We might also write a parallel story based on an experience that we had. So making a personal connection to the story. Um, Sometimes we'll actually, write it down, or make like a PowerPoint of like a class story that they all contribute and write together. Sometimes we'll make a video. Sometimes we'll do some kind of extension activity all together. If we're doing like a science unit of some kind, or like a nonfiction unit, Maybe they write a report instead of a story, but any kind of extension activity where, again, they're, um, synthesizing all of the skills and all of the goals that they've worked on throughout the whole unit. Lots of different ideas here. And again, same kind of situation, but just with a different book. So for this student, his goal was to write complete sentences. So 3 to 4 sentences could be a whole story, right? If he includes all the parts of the story that are relevant, um, there you go. There's a story in 3 to 4 sentences. Again, our goal here is just applying all the structures that we've learned to something else. So you start, the way that I kind of visualize the literacy-based therapy framework is that you start with kind of this broad topic, right? And you activate all of the knowledge that you have related to this topic. And then through the dialogic reading and the comprehension discussion, you sort of narrow your focus down to what do you want the students to gain from this unit the most? And then with a parallel story, you kind of zoom back out again, right? And we say, like, okay, like, how can we apply this to a different scenario or a different topic, or write a new story, or have some kind of like extension of what this looks like in the world? Just a few random other ideas for how to create parallel stories. There are lots of like storytelling apps that are available for not that much money. PowerPoints, I do a lot, will record voice or record the voice, the generated voice of an AAC device if that is available. And the students will really like to listen or watch back the PowerPoint with their voice recordings. That could be really fun. Making a physical book, either individual books or a class book. Comic strips, I've done comic strips. Programming messages into speech generating devices so they can tell stories or retell stories in a more kind of streamlined way without having to like construct each individual sentence every time. And again, retelling from different characters' point of view. So lots of possibilities here. We're almost done. I just have a couple things that I wanted to show you. Again, just kind of generally, my guidance here is that you just plan in advance. You can have so much more success if you are familiar with your text and you know where you want to go with it. This reference sheet is linked somewhere. I might have to relink that one. But anyway, there's an example of how I sort of go through and pull out the targets and then just make myself. Oh, I had a sneeze and I lost it. There we go. Okay, sorry. This is just a really quick way that I can look at a book and say like, oh, okay, great. Like there are lots of L sounds in this book. Like I can use it for that student. And again, the targets don't have to be directly from the book. They can also be implicit. Don't spend time making a lot of materials that are specific to one book only. You probably won't use them. You may not use them the first time you make them, and you definitely won't use them in subsequent years, is what I've learned. So learn from my mistakes and only make materials that are generalizable. And then there's also a sample lesson plan and like a lesson plan template that you guys can use. Really quickly, this is how I store material. So this is kind of the reference sheet that I was talking about. You probably can't see it because it's really tiny, but this is just a list of like, here's tier 1 vocabulary words, which is like core essentially. Here's tier 2, here's tier 3. These are all targets that appear in this book. Here are some basic questions. Here's a list of inferential questions. Here are all of the different speech sounds and what words they appear in the book, and then whether, there's just like a check if there's in initial or medial or final position. So really quickly at a glance, I can pull out a book and say like, okay, like this book is going to work for my students and their goals, or it's not. And then just a handful of kind of like general visuals. So these visuals of like the mango and the bat and the owl and the bird, I like because I can use them to to in like a sentence construction activity, or I can use them to fill out a graphic organizer if we're doing like a retell, like here are the different things that um that happened in the story, like a bat was sleeping upside down and got in trouble from the bird or whatever. And then I have these little clear pockets that are sticky on one side, and I stick it in the back of the book, and then all of these little visuals live in that pocket, and they are stored in the book forever and allow me to really quickly reference whether or not the book is going to work for what I want it to work for. So that's kind of my quick note on materials. The last thing that I told you I would get to is the story grammar, or the narrative framework that I use. So I use Story Grammar Marker, which is, again, a lot more concrete than saying like first, next, then last. It breaks down a story into all of these different parts. They also have a developmental trajectory for what parts of a narrative develop first, and then what ages kids are when they acquire new parts of a story. So, and it doesn't necessarily go in order here from top to bottom. I really, really, really love this framework and this resource. Highly recommend checking it out. um you know even teaching like these first 5 here, character, setting, problem, feelings, and plan, are like, man, if your kids can do that, that's a good narrative right there. So um and it gives, again, a lot more concrete sort of pieces to how to tell a story. Handful of resources. Most of these things are linked for you. Blogs are great. Blogs got lots of ideas. Make sure that what you're looking at has some evidence to support it. But beyond that, SLP bloggers are really great for making things kind of like user friendly and very accessible. So and lots of them have like newsletters that they send out free materials in all the time. So that's also a bonus. And that's it. So I'm happy to stick around. I know it's later than I had intended, but I'm happy to stick around for questions and whatnot for a little bit.
Thank you, Melissa.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So when you choose the book that you will be using for the therapy, like how do you usually decide which one are the good ones? And then like, do you get that from the library, or do you buy it on your own? Or like the school has budget for it? Like how does that process work?
Yeah, so great question. Like I said, I try to align whatever I'm doing to the curriculum as much as possible. And so I work in an elementary setting. Many, if not most, elementary settings sort of plan their year like at least a little bit thematically, right? So like around the holidays, they do holiday things because that's what kids like to do. And like the 2 weeks leading up to Halloween, it's like impossible to talk about anything else because all the kids want to talk about is Halloween and their costume. So you know, so whatever is happening in their class is kind of what I try to do. I have my own personal library of books that I have accumulated over many years of practice, some of which I have purchased, many of which I have gotten for free from my colleagues or from donations. Um, you know, at the end of the year, every year, everybody's getting rid of all of their stuff, and there's just like boxes of books outside every classroom. And I always take the opportunity to kind of dig through and find things that I want. Yeah, the school library or the public library are great resources. I've made a number of donors choose um, projects for, you know, requesting certain books that I know that I want. It's a big, you know, there are a lot of resources. Epic, did I link that? Let me look. Yeah, Epic is a good resource for books. Um, they don't always have like the most current books. They don't necessarily have new releases, but they do have a really good and large library of books and audiobooks that are available for free if you sign up with your like education email address.
Melissa, I'd also like to mention Donors Choose at this point, because did I miss that you just said that? Thank you.
Donors Choose is great. Yeah, I have worked for 3 school districts, and I have not yet known one that provides a budget to speech language pathologists. So I'm fortunate to work at a school where the PTA provides me with a small budget to buy resources, but um, the special education department does not.
Thank you for so much information. Incredible.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah.
So as Melissa mentioned, she will be back in the fall in SPED 746 to talk to you about language sampling analysis and also potentially either through a recording or maybe in person if we can convince her to talk with kind of the second part of this lecture. So thank you very, very much for your time. It's really lovely to have you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, guys, I'm going to pause the recording